So if it's a private foundation, or if it's a federal grant, or if it's a county grant, like with JALA, um, you have to really spend some time. And Chris and I will give you guidelines today for how to do this. But you really need to think about also what they are looking for as an outcome of your work. So that's what we talk about. Clearly communicate meaningful and quantifiable outcomes. So we'll be giving a lot of information on how to do that later. Next slide, please. And so, given all the information that we're going to be finding out about our funders before we submit grants, effective grant seeking, and by that we mean successful grant seeking, means putting the right ask in front of the right funder at the right time. And that's, sometimes I know that I actually had a boss who used to say, and he was a smart fundraiser, he used to say, no doesn't necessarily mean no, it might just mean not now. Right? So that's the key about the right time. And that comes through also understanding our funders' priorities at any given time. So we have to think about who they are, what they want to fund, and then what is the best time for them to fund. So that doesn't mean that necessarily when we are in need of the money, it's going to be the best time for them to support that particular type of project. So I guess this all goes to say, know thy funder. Thank you, Chris. Perfect. And I always include that slide because I like that little guy. So I think the next slide is yours, Chris, right?
I think this is, oh, yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So one of the questions that we got actually as we were preparing for this workshop was we had a lot of organizations that said, I'm able to get funding from a lot of places, but for small amounts. And, how can I get more bang for my buck, basically? And of course, that just depends on who you're applying to. But what kind of along that same line, we thought, it's always, I mean, I go for any money that I can get, right? Like $1,000 is not too small for me. And so I know that there's a lot of those opportunities, but you do need to make those requests efficient so that you're not spending a ton of time for just a small amount of funding. And so we had some other questions just along the lines of how to even just establish a basic grant writing program. And so here are just some tips, and even some people have found, even when they already have a pretty established program, that just sometimes a new idea is helpful. But and Jayla, have we given individuals the link to all of the documents that we'll be referencing in the training today?
No, we'll send that out. I think there's some access issues with it, but we'll get it sorted and sent out too.
Okay, perfect. So one thing that Lisa and I have done is we've put together a folder of various documents and templates for your use to help you as we go through some of these things. And so when you get that link from Jayla after this training, we'll be referencing and showing you examples of what some of these documents look like, so that if it looks like something that would be helpful to you, you'll have access to that. And so the first thing that I always do when I start a new grant writing program, or when I jump into one that's already existing, is to set up a generic grants email address. So grants@xyzfoundation.org. I know this sounds really simple, but I've had so many issues where you use a staff person's email address when you create a portal or you submit an application, and then that person leaves, or maybe they're still there, but you try to get in and you can't get the password reset, and it can just be really frustrating. And so I always suggest that you do just a generic one that stands the test of time. It helps with turnover, it helps with access, it just makes everything a lot easier, especially if you have more than one person at your organization that is helping with grants. And then you can have it forward on, but then at least everybody can be on the same page, and you have a consistent place for award letters and things like that. Also, just this is what we've got some good templates for, is a grants calendar. It's surprising to me how many clients we walk into and they don't have a system for just tracking grants. You can get really sophisticated software programs, but sometimes just something really simple like an Excel spreadsheet. And I'll go ahead and show you just kind of an example where you want to track, obviously, the dates of when things are due and when they're submitted, your request amounts, award amounts, all of that information. One really important thing is to keep track of report due dates. So every time I get an award letter, I make sure that I record and look into what the report due dates are, because it can be really easy to forget about those. And we had somebody ask, what's the difference if you look at the column that says hard or soft? That just means if it's a deadline that is a hard set deadline versus this is when we usually submit this grant. And so it's in there as like a soft deadline, but it's a little bit flexible. So this is also,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
Lisa.
Well, one thing about soft deadlines, I learned that even though they're soft in that they're not due, for example, on the 15th of a particular month, foundations who are your returning funders or they are often in the pattern of giving to your organization in a particular part of the year. So if you were to come in at a later time of the year, they might not have a slot for you. So even if it's a soft deadline, if it's one that you've approached a funder for in the past, you'll want to try and stick with that. And that's part of building your grants calendar too, to know what's coming up at what time, and to maybe build in some of the soft deadlines in with the hard deadlines, because then, the soft deadlines are a little squishier. But do keep in mind that particularly private foundations will expect you to come in at about the same time every year.
A lot of them won't let you do it more than once within the same calendar year.
Within the same year.
Even if you're going to end up getting the money just once a year, if you shift your request time, like sometimes they won't take a look at it.
Right. Yep.
When you guys open up this document, when you get access to it, we do have a tab that on the bottom of the spreadsheet where it has a place where you can keep track of all of your logins. I know that's just a basic organizational tip, but having a place where you actually keep track of your contacts, your usernames, your passwords, the different websites for all the different portals and things like that. It's crazy when I started my career and everything was on paper and you were always going to the post office or dropping it off at someone's office, and now it's almost all of them are online. So having a place, we kind of keep that together with the grants calendar, so it's just quick and easy access. So. And then going back to the list, we have also included a list of attachments. And whether you're starting a grant writing program or you have one already in place, it's really helpful, especially if you're wanting to just whip out a lot of these smaller grants and have it not take a lot of time. It's helpful to put everything all in one folder, one place. And so we have a list here of all the different kinds of attachments that we have found that funders ask for. And so when I start with a new client, I always start by just gathering as much of these types of documents as I can. We kind of put them into different categories. Your founding documents. Any of you who have written grants before, you're very familiar that these are a lot of things that are requested. And so if you have them just all in one place, but some of them are a little bit less obvious. I've had a lot of times where just having like a voided check on file for deposits from funders has been helpful. Obviously your board list, lots of different policies and plans. If you have an organization, if your organization doesn't have some of these policies in place, it might be something to think about adding into your board meeting schedule discussion about some of these things so that you're ready to go. And it also just helps with your general operations. But digital letterhead, annual report, letters of support, all of these things, I think the more that you have them all put together, the easier. So this document is in the folder if you want to refer to it later.
Chris, real quick, I think I just figured out the access thing. So I posted the link in the chat.
Oh, perfect.
If you all want to access it there, let me know if you have issues.
Excellent. So yeah, if you want to pull that up, if you have any questions about what any of those are. The next thing on the list, previous right here, is a master generic proposal and a grant proposal template. So it might be easier. I mean, go ahead and take a look at the example that we have in the folder, but I'm going to just scoop ahead real quick to, I think we have, oh, I don't know that I do. Okay, so I'll just talk about it, but we'll go back to that right there. So a master generic proposal, Lisa and I have put this in the folder for you to look at, but anytime that I write a grant, when I used to do it, I would say, okay, oh, I think I wrote about that in like my Eccles application over here, or, oh, I think I might have talked about diversity like in this application. And I would go and dig through all my different applications to copy and paste from. And then I realized, oh, there's such a smarter way to do this. And so we have a template in there where anytime you write a grant, it's got just almost every single question that we've come across in grant applications, and you have space where you can just fill in what you have written in the past. So every time I write a new grant, if I'm writing any new narrative, I'll add it into this. It includes things like at the very beginning, it's got all your basic information, like the date you were established and your basic budget information for the year and whatnot. But then it goes into all of the different narratives. And I have sometimes even multiple options for the same narrative. For example, tell us about your mission. I have like a 1-sentence version. I have a couple paragraph version. And I have it because, as you know, there's different word counts within a grant application. And so that is something that I have found to make my grant writing a whole lot faster, a lot more efficient, and more streamlined. And that's a document that is a really good idea to update every year when you're doing new applications to the same funders. And then lastly,
Wait, Chris, I mean, that's an important point. It's, if we don't want to go back to the same funders year after year, because they're our best funders, and just present them stale narrative that we presented in previous years. Believe me, a lot of organizations do this, and I think it will set you apart if you can keep it fresh and update it with, for example, in 2022, here's some specific things that we did that so that you can make it look like you're not just cutting and pasting every year. Because what that tells them is that you don't care enough to do a good proposal. Why should they care enough to fund you?
Yeah.
That's a pet peeve of mine anyway. I don't know if, because I see it a lot where people just cut and paste old narrative.
And when I say that I'm cutting and pasting from other applications, I'll take like my basic narrative from this document, but then I'm always taking the time to tailor it specifically to the intricacies of their questions or to that specific organization. And then the last thing that you'll see when you open up the folder that Jayla gives you access to is what we call a grant proposal template. This is basically a document that I use every time I start a new grant, and it's very basic. I fill it in, and it gives, like, at the very top, I'll type the funder, and then I'll put the website for the portal, the username, the password. So I have all of that really quick and easy. And then what I do is I make sure that I am typing up and putting in the whole grant application in like a Word document that I copy and paste into the portal. I know there's a lot of organizations where they'll just submit their applications straight into the portal. And sometimes it'll give you an option to print out or to save what you had already submitted, but it's usually in a PDF file that makes it a lot harder to format or to use in future years. But sometimes you don't get that at all. I've had colleagues that will write an application and something goes wrong and then they have to start it all over because they didn't save it in a document that they can keep on their drive. And so this is just another resource for you if it's helpful, but it's good to have that as just a habit. Every time I start a new grant, I open up this template, I fill in all the basics right at the beginning, and then I can share it like with the executive director or whoever it is that reviews the grants. And if they want to go into the portal, like, it's all right there. They don't have to go to the grant tracker or some other place to look up the username or the password. So that's just there. If it's helpful for you, then great. Any other questions about just some of those basics or anything else, Lisa, that you would want to jump in on?
Well, I just want to do a shout out to you because everyone, Chris is the most organized grant writer I have ever met in my life. And so I suggest that you take these tips and take the tools that she uses, because if you can be organized in any way that Chris is, you will be far down the road.
Well, I just know what it's like when you have a lot of deadlines. And I've told Lisa this, like, I've got 6 kids. I don't have time to do the same thing twice. So, if I've done it once, I don't want to have to do it again if I don't have to. So just some thoughts and tips for you if it's helpful. So now I know that one of the biggest things that people asked us about, we kind of went over these, so I'll skip through these, is prospect research. Yeah. And Lisa, I think we kind of were sharing, like, do you want me to go over the slide or do you want to jump into?
I'll go over it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. So yes, as Chris mentioned, we Jayla, some of you may have remembered that Jayla reached out to you and asked what sorts of topics you are particularly interested in receiving information on. And prospect research was a big one. So we've got quite a bit of information on it. And I just start out now with some sort of general ideas, and then Chris will really dig into the how-tos. So as I mentioned earlier, understanding a grantor is key to putting the right ask in front of the right funder at the right time. So prospect research is how we understand our grantors. And through prospect research, we not only identify the grantor, but it helps us to understand any potential relationships. And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that, do you have a board member who knows one of the trustees, or do you have a board member who works at Salt Lake County and could have some relationship to help you gain access to a funder that might not otherwise be a really great fit. It also, research helps you determine whether or not the funder has an affinity for your cause. What does that mean? Affinity means that they like to support the kind of work that you do. So, an affinity is critical. Like, I remember back in my early days of grant writing, people would say, well, just submit a grant to the Gates Foundation. It's like, well, okay, but do they have an affinity for what we're doing at this little tiny nonprofit in Salt Lake City, Utah? No. So research will help you, the third bullet there, match the right donor to the right program and also to your organization. Also, research will help tell you how much to ask. It informs your request amount, because you don't want to go in and shoot the moon, like ask for a $100,000 grant. And then if you look at their giving history, you see that they only give typically $10,000 grants, because asking for way too much is a worse mistake, I think, than asking for way too little, because it really shows, again, it shows the funder that you have not taken the time to understand them. And so then this last bullet I sort of hit on already, but it helps you find a match between your services and organizations that are likely to support them. So you can find out, you not only look at who supports organizations of your type, but who supports particular programs of the type that you offer. Like whether it's social services, or whether it's housing, or whether it's homelessness or volunteerism. You can search, and Chris will teach you how to do this. You can search on a lot of different terms to find out who supports the kinds of programs that you offer. Next, please. Thank you. So qualifying your prospects. So we have 3 different levels of prospects. Basically, we have strong, we have medium connection, we have weak prospects, and then we have not a prospect. And so strong prospects will have a direct connection to your organization. A board member works there, or a board member has even come to you and said, apply to this organization. That's a strong connection. They'll have a history of giving to causes like yours, and not 20 years ago, but like in the last 5 years. If they used to support your kind of organization 20 years ago, maybe their board of directors has changed, and whoever used to be interested in supporting your kind of work has gone off the board or has passed away if it's a family foundation, and the new generation is just not interested in supporting that kind of work. So it's important to look at whether or not they've supported organizations like yours recently. Okay, this third bullet to me is the most important basic search. They have a history of giving in your area. I think that, again, it's kind of the Gates Foundation example. They're not, I always start out my searches by looking at who gives in Utah, or at least who gives in the Mountain West, let alone Salt Lake County, Weber County, Davis County, Washington County, etc. Then also the next bullet, same thing, they give in your program area. And the final bullet seems like an obvious one, but you'd be amazed how many groups don't think about it. They give, they have a capacity to give. Like if they're a little tiny foundation, and maybe you're doing some research and you find out that their assets are only 250,000, that's not much of a capacity to give. And Chris can help you understand more about that later. But so you're looking at their giving history of the amounts they've given in the past, but also maybe they're not giving at all. Maybe they have an interest in the kind of work you do, but they just don't have the assets to give right now. So that would not make them not a strong prospect. Next slide, please. So good prospects meet 3 of your criteria. Potential prospects meet 2 of your criteria, And potential prospects can become good or strong prospects. How? If there's a relationship. That's the one reason, that's the one way that maybe if a funder normally doesn't give in Utah, but you've got a board member or someone they might interest them in giving in Utah. So building relationships is the best way to increase the likelihood of funding. Next, please. So again, the not a prospect is they don't meet any of your criteria. And in this case, just let it go. Like even if they're a strong prospect for giving in your kind of area or your kind of work or organization, but they only give in Minneapolis, just let it go unless you have a relationship. So the thing about research, I think good researchers, and Chris, maybe you can verify this, but good researchers carve out time to do the research. That's how you have to be systematic. Because if you just kind of like do it 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there, you're not being you're not reviewing and eliminating based on the same criteria.
Well,
And
I like too, Lisa, what you say in terms of making it like an intentional effort.
yep,
I know, I'm sure this is the same way for all of you, but I feel like sometimes I'm just trying to get all the deadlines met, you know, and I'm just trying to get my work done, and life is crazy and you're juggling a ton of things. But if you just start reacting to, oh, so and so said, oh, here's a link, you should apply for this, you should apply for that, you know, you'll catch things. But if you really just decide, I'm going to take like, I mean, I feel like a big research project for me, I usually will spend about 20 hours. Um, and that will give me a very substantial report of new funding opportunities to reach for. And so if you have, you know, a couple really big chunks of time that you can really dedicate to this, it definitely does pay off.
definitely. So the next slide, please. So as you're researching, reviewing, and eliminating, the first cut for elimination is a yes or no criteria. Do they give in your geographic area? Are you within their deadline dates? Do they support in the areas that you do your work? Do they support in the programs that you have? Is the average grant award in the realm of something that would be appropriate for your organization? And do you serve their target community or population? Meaning, for example, Salt Lake or Minneapolis or Latinx populations or homeless populations. So these are yes or no. So that's your first cut. And the next slide is your second cut. These are more sort of like they start to become a little more subjective. Who have they given to in the past? Have they funded a project similar to yours? If so, where? So these are details that you can add to your yes or no cuts. Next slide. And the third cut are scored criteria. And again, this is a really in-depth way to do it. And I know working in small nonprofits, you often won't have the time to really kind of set up this sort of a system. But back to Chris's point about setting up your systems early and just having them in place. If you set it up at the beginning of your research effort, it will continue to support you all throughout whenever you're doing research. So your third cut is sort of the scored criteria. Are you able to get the grant done? Do you have the staff? I mean, if it's a big federal or public grant, do you have the staff to get it done? Do you have a relationship with them? Is it highly competitive? Because if you don't have a relationship and it's highly competitive, then you just might not stand a chance. What is the likelihood of an award? And then what is your likely return on investment? If you invest 20 hours and are the odds good that you're going to get the grant? So these are sort of your third way of assessing whether or not it's a good prospect for you.
Yeah, and Lisa, I would say don't be afraid to ask some questions that would help you determine some of these answers. For example, the organization that I referred to earlier that had received funding 5 years ago and then hadn't for 5 years because things had gotten more sophisticated, they you can't often get like a meeting with a funder to see why it was that they're not funding you. But this particular organization was very generous about that. And we asked, you know, how many applications do you get? Because they had a couple different categories that we could apply to. And as we were trying to decide which one we had the best shot at, which one was the best fit, we just asked, how many people apply for this pot versus this pot? And they were really open. They said, if you can really make it a good fit, like explain to us how what you're doing here helps families versus just mental health in general, we get far fewer applicants in this pool. And so you have a better likelihood. Or they told us in this other pool, we usually get 60 different applications and we can fund 5. And so knowing what your odds are can really help you as you make some of these decisions. And don't be afraid to ask. And
Don't be afraid to
they
ask.
might say, we're not going to tell you that. But oftentimes, funders are quite open to helping you as best they can.
Yeah. Okay, so this is you, Chris. I think.
Yeah. So before I actually go through this list, I'm just going to show you an example of when I put together a research profile on a new funder. This is an example of what one might look like. So for example, this is the BW Bastion Foundation. And I like to just put all the basic contact info right up at the top. Obviously, if I already know that they're not going to be a funder, I don't put all this kind of effort. But what I'll do is I'll just put all the basic contact info up at the top, including their portals, websites, all of that. I'll pull their main contact. I'll pull their board members. And the reason I do their board members is, as Lisa mentioned, those relationships. A lot of times, if I'm considering a new funder, I will ask the executive director or anybody in the organization or members of our own board, do you have any personal relationships or connections with their board? And a lot of times that will be really helpful information to have. I'll obviously put down all the other basic info, deadlines, suggested amount, descriptions, and the applicable giving history, which I will cover in just a moment. But this is kind of that as a list here so that you can take a look at that. The reason that I do, obviously, the recent applicable giving history is to help guide an appropriate request. Just as Lisa mentioned, it looks really bad, and a funder doesn't sometimes know what to do with an application when you're asking for 20,000, but most of their gifts are 1,000. A lot of times they'll just reject it, or they'll be like, well, how can we help you fund this program if this isn't even close to like filling your needs? And so having that applicable giving history really helps guide those decisions, not just for your request amount, but to see if you're like the right fit. And you might be saying, well, that's great, but where do you get the information to put something like this together? And here is a list of some resources. And Jayla, I just realized we need to update this to include the Salt Lake City Library. So I will mention that. But for those of you who might have the printout of the slides, I'll have you kind of pencil that in at the end. But in order to do most of my basic research, I'll go to GuideStar. I don't know if any of you have used that website before, but it's basically a collection of tax filings from different nonprofits. And you need to create an account, but it's free. And once you get that set up, you can do a search on any foundation. And what it'll do is it'll pull up their previous tax documents. There are some nonprofit or foundations that have gotten really savvy. They maybe don't want some of that information public, and so they redact it. But for the most part, I can go in and look at a 99D, and they have to list everybody that they had given donations to. And usually it'll be a couple years outdated. Like I'm seeing some 2021 filings right now, but a lot of times right now it's still maybe 2020. But it's enough to at least get you started, especially for organizations that fund the same organizations year after year. But if you go through and you can see, okay, who are all the different organizations that they funded and at what amounts? I had one client who every year they'd been getting asking for and receiving $1,000 from a particular organization, and I took a look at their the grants they had given in years past, and the next lowest that they were giving was 5,000, and everybody got 5,000 or above. And so I showed this to them. I said, you really should ask for 5,000 because that's like their base amount. They probably were only giving 1,000 because that's what they'd always just asked for. And they didn't realize that they weren't asking for enough. And so it helps on both ends to not ask for too much or to ask for too little. And so GuideStart is a great resource. Also, before I got to that, Google is surprisingly a really great resource for grant research. So don't discount that. I should have grabbed an example, but anytime I go to the symphony, for example, or any type of event that is run by a nonprofit, I will snag a copy of the program because they will list who their donors are in the program. They often won't give specifics on amounts, but sometimes they will, like, here's our gold star donors that gave 50,000 and above, and here's our silver star donors. And so that'll give you an idea of who they funded. But if you're an arts organization, go to some other nonprofits arts events and snag their programs and take a look at who's funding them that might be interested in funding you. Websites, a lot of organizations will maybe at least put the logos of their supporters on their website. And annual reports are a great resource if you, especially online. A lot of organizations are giving online. And I would say, don't be afraid to, for example, if you are an affiliate of a larger organization, like, a Boys and Girls Club or whatever, where there's multiple smaller entities within the same organization, take a look at the national annual report if you want to start expanding beyond just Utah. And there's just a lot of options and resources that way. So that's one resource.
Can I just add one thing about programs? And it's always when you, for example, if you're a small orchestra and you go to the symphony and you see, oh my gosh, this donor that supports us is supporting this other organization for a lot more than they're giving us. What's the difference? Well, it could be their budget size, the other organization's budget size just warrants larger grants, but also it could be because they have a relationship. And so again, we're going to kind of keep harping on that the people who make decisions about funding are people, right? They're not just organizations or sort of behind the curtain. So building relationships in the community with any kind of funder can always help your chances of getting and receiving a larger grant.
Yeah, and the scope of this workshop, we don't go into reports very often, but when you submit reports on a funding that you've received, that's a huge opportunity to build relationships. And some organizations don't require a report, but it's a really good idea to send one anyway, so that you can point out to them the difference that their donation made. It's a great way to initiate a new request. But as you take those opportunities to foster the relationships, don't forget that reports aren't just like one more thing that you have to do, but they're that huge opportunity for relationship building. Okay, and now the next few bullets are actual like website services that can help connect you to different research opportunities. Foundation Directory is a really great one. It's very expensive. I can't remember, Lisa. It's like what, at least $1,000?
Oh, more. Yeah, I think even just for one user, it's like 4,000 a year or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's
outside the realm for a lot of small groups.
Yeah, it's really, really expensive. However, go ahead and either write this in on your hard copy or make a note. We mentioned this in the last time we did this workshop, but the Salt Lake City Library is a great resource, especially if you want to access some of these subscription services. If you call just the downtown Salt Lake City Library, they actually have people there who you can make an appointment with, and they will actually sit down with you and guide you through a lot of these different resources just to help you with grant writing. And I believe they will give you access. Like if you use it at the library, you can get access without having to pay those subscriptions. So super great resource, and we'll make sure we update this slide with that.
Put the link too in the chat, Chris, for that.
Oh, that'd be perfect. Thank you. Grant Watch is another one. Grant Station, you just Google those and it'll take you to their websites, so you can set those up. I will say I really like Grant Watch because you don't have to do a long-term subscription. A lot of times when you're doing research, like you just really want to sit down and carve out a big chunk of time to just kind of do it, and then you don't necessarily need to come back to it anytime soon. With Grant Watch, you can do just a subscription for a week at a time, and I think it's about $18. And so I feel like they have really good resources. If you want something more long-term, a lot of these subscription services will send opportunities tailored to your organization, to your inbox, if you want to pay more of a long-term subscription. But usually what I'll do is I'll say, okay, I'm going to do grant research. Here I go. And I'll, pay the 18 bucks. And then I sit down and I will type in, I love Grant Watch. You can put in whether you want private funding, government funding. You put in what kind of work your nonprofit does. It has a whole lot of different filtering options. And usually when I put those all in, I'll have a couple hundred to kind of skim through. And a lot of them won't be a great fit, but you kind of have to dig through those to get to the ones that really are. And I found that one to be really helpful. Also, I think we might mention it as we get later on, but a lot of foundations don't actually administer their grant writing themselves. They're just busy, or maybe whoever set up the foundation has now passed away, and so the children don't want to have to deal with it. So a lot of our local banks will actually administer foundation grant making processes, and Wells Fargo is one of those. US Bank is one of those. And so a lot of times those banks will have like foundation search directories of who they service, and Wells Fargo has a pretty good one that is a helpful resource as well. So those are just some good options for getting that. And then that's how I put together the funder profile for each organization, and that's been a good way to go. So I think, last one, I've got one that's specific. I had some people asking about government funding. If you want to go for some of those, there's obviously you'll find some of those through the grant research websites that were on the previous slide. But go ahead and take a look at each city or county or state that you're looking to apply for. And these are some direct links that will take you to the different departments that might have different funding opportunities. A lot of times, unfortunately, like there's not like one place where you can say, what are all the grant opportunities with Salt Lake County? But this will give you a list of all the different departments. And if you click on that link, it'll take you to each one. And if they've got any opportunities going on at the moment, they've got live links that make it really easy. And maybe I'll let Jayla jump in on this too, but one thing that's really helpful is to join newsletter lists, email lists. If you know that you do housing, get on the email list for the department that handles housing, because that's the best place where they're going to advertise different grant funding opportunities. If you just go to these links, you may likely only see whatever's active or open at the moment, and you might miss something unless you're checking those websites pretty regularly. So get onto those different email lists. And then also social media. Jayla, I'll let you speak to, I know you had a really great comment about that in the last workshop.
Yeah, it's hard because we don't have like Chris mentioned, we don't have a central database with all of our grants opportunities. But for the departments that do put out grant opportunities, you should follow them on Instagram and Twitter. That's like economic development does a lot, housing and community development, the health department. If you type in like Salt Lake County, you'll find the ones that are giving out money because they're the only ones that really have social media presence.
Mm-hmm.
And then just another note with government funding, we get this question a lot, but grants for Salt Lake County can only serve county residents within the county jurisdiction. So just make sure that you're geographically focused when you're looking at city and county grants.
Yeah, and if you serve more than just the county, like that's fine. I've had lots of applications that I've submitted, but you just need to be sophisticated enough with how you gather and track your data that you can separate that out. So, I've written applications before where I say, okay, we have 7 different sites across the state, but we're going to center our application just on the one that is located right here and that just serves people within, the county. So it's not limiting, but if you're going to do that, you just need to make sure that your application is zeroed in on just the program that fits within that geography and the people that are served by it. Great. All right, Lisa, I'm going to hand the baton over to you.
Okay, so we're going to talk about you've done your research, you've identified some prospective funders, and now you need to write your application. And so you really want to tell 2 different stories as you're writing this application. Chris, Can you switch slides, please?
Yes.
Thanks. The first story is the story to appeal to the right brain. This is the organization story, which is the things that we all theoretically have at our fingertips because we've organized our grant templates like Chris has told us to. So facts and figures. This means what's your budget? What are your program budgets? What are the salaries of the people within your organization? How much do you dedicate to overhead versus to program expenses? Also, the organization story will be your history and your track record. This is important in particular to private funders. Foundations like to fund success, right? So they want to know that most of them won't fund you unless you've been around for 3 years or more. And even then, there's something about saying, for example, that your organization has been around since 1992 or has been around even since 2002. It shows a history of good management and funding, and so I do brag about the track record. I make a point of it, and if it's a new organization, then I'll say even this is how much we've grown in the last 3 years since we first were started. And a lot of times this goes back to what I told you my old boss used to say, it doesn't mean no, it just might mean not now. I had an organization that I was applying for funding for, and they were relatively new. And I applied to a couple of foundations, and the first couple years there was no response. And then the third year we got a response. And that's because we kept knocking on the door, right? We didn't just go away after we asked the first time and didn't get a response. And then also because we showed a history of longevity, of being around and being successful. So that's important. I like to paint pictures about what we've been doing. And I think that while you're talking about your history and track record, you also can tell pictures about your evidence of good management. First of all, I think the fact that you've been around for a number of years begs the question that that it is an illustration of good management. But you want to talk about if you have annual audits, or if you've been GuideStar certified, or if you get a gold seal, or even if you like get the best of state for Salt Lake City, or some of those awards, the local awards that are given, or if you've been given a recognition award by some group. So anything that can really show that your organization is set apart from the rest.
And Lisa, on that, I don't know if this is your experience, but I'm noticing more and more funders asking for, like, what is your status on GuideStar or Charity Navigator or those types of websites. And so something to think about when you're not feeling like you're drowning with grant deadlines and you've got maybe some time to be intentional about what you're doing. A lot of organizations don't claim their profiles on those types of websites. So for example, GuideStar is a really common one. Go look up, as you're doing research on foundations, type in your own organization into the search bar at GuideStar and see what comes up, and see if you guys have claimed that as your own organization, and go through the process of doing that. Usually to get a really high rating that donors look to feel that you're legit and that you're well managed, you mostly just have to like upload information. And sometimes it really only takes like an hour or two worth of time, but then you have it, you're up there, you're good to go. And then when it comes time that a funder is asking, what is your rating on this website or that website, like you've already taken care of it and gotten it done. So that's something to, think about if you haven't done it yet.
Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can I, thanks. So I was wondering how much is too much? Because a lot of the grants give you a limited number of words, or, limited to the information. So I understand that we need to prioritize and see like what is that we're gonna be sharing in the grant about our organization. But there's a lot of facts like you just mentioned, like the GuideStar, like a little bit of the history, what have been the highlights for the last few years. But sometimes there's no room in the forms. Yeah, how much is too much? Like as a grant reviewer, how much do you want to see? I know those are important things, but when they tell you 500 words describe the background of your organization, my impression is like the grant reviewers don't want to go through a lot.
Exactly. And that's a really good question. And that's important to think about. So, and this kind of goes back to what Chris was talking about, how in her template or in her generic proposal, she keeps a lot of different versions of the same information. And that is so that she can have different word counts and different character counts. But even within those word counts and character counts, if you have 500 words, usually that's awesome. That's a lot, right? You're usually not going to get that many. You're usually going to get like 2,000 characters or 4,000 characters or something like that. You have to think about, go all the way back to your prospect research and think about what is important to this funder. So what are the things that I already have in my quiver of arrows that I need to tell this funder? And again, that's why you don't want to just assume you just do cut and paste narrative for every application. So if I only have, like I was working on a grant yesterday where I had 250 characters to do mission and background. Well, okay, that's not a lot. And most mission statements are longer than 250 characters. And there were some things within that subject or that topic that I wanted to be sure they knew, but there was no room within those character counts. So I moved some of that information artfully into another section. And so if you don't have, if you say what is too much, well, too much is verbosity, right? I mean, too many words, not really answering the question that they get to. But if you do have more information to give them in the question that they're asking, and you can't fit it in a current section, I will try and work it into another section. So I think Chris, do you have anything else to add to that?
I would say, like, as we're talking about GuideStar, for example, that's usually, I don't think I ever mention it unless they're specifically asking for it.
Yeah.
So we're throwing out a whole lot of different ideas and thoughts, but I don't provide a whole lot more than what they're asking for, just because, and Lisa will, in a few slides down the road, talk about how to make your application efficient and easy for the reader to like get through it, so that they don't just get bogged down by too many words. But I think it's a really good point that you can't fit it all in, and that's okay. Like, just give them what they're asking for, because that's what they want.
That's what they want. And don't give them something else that they're not asking for just because you haven't thought to really identify what it is they're asking for. So one of the I lost my thought track. Well, hopefully it'll come back to me. But let's go to so we're on the next slide, the human story. This is the second part of our story. This is the I'm sorry, I got it backwards last time. The facts and figures are the left brain. This is the right brain part. So this is you're talking about the real people and the real impact. So you're bringing it from the abstract of talking about your organization's numbers and data and dollars, and you're bringing it down to a single human dimension. And the premise is that there are hundreds of organizations in the community that are worth supporting and maybe are even going for the same funding that you're going for. So you need to break through the clutter and make it real. And so donors, particularly for private foundations or private funders, they have no concept of millions of dollars or thousands of children or thousands of people starving or millions of people affected by a flood, or they can help one person. I mean, that's sort of the concept. So make it real to them, paint a picture in their mind about one family. So it's, you can't ask people to fix poverty, but if you want to ask a funder to help you support 500 families by providing them with XYZ specific items over this exact period of time, that helps funders to get their mind around it, and it makes it real to them. And also, don't be afraid to show the ugly. You can paint a picture of a really, like, okay, so for example, Chris, let's do the next slide. Don't be afraid, a picture of this is obvious. A picture is worth 1,000 words, but a personal story is worth 1,000 statistics. So in a recent grant that I was awarded on behalf of a client, I told a story of, we were asking for funding for a food pantry, which is, you can talk about dollars and things bought and number of people served, but what I made sure to include in this application was a story of one particular family. So I and this is a true story. I was sitting in on a board meeting for the organization, and the executive director told this story of before Christmas, a mother came in and with her children with her, and she filled up 11 bags of food, which was more than it's a small pantry, so this is more than they normally will let families take. But this mother was crying the whole time she was filling up her bags of food. And then when they left and they were on the way walking back to their car in the parking lot, her children opened up two of the cans of cream of whatever soup and were eating them cold out of the can on the way back to their car. So that paints a picture in someone's mind. And I know you don't have the space in every one of your grant applications to tell those kinds of stories, but hopefully you can see the difference between talking about data and figures versus painting a picture in someone's mind. A picture is emotional, and that's what moves donors to give. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say we have a couple of questions if you have time for that now, but we can.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have Marilyn and Sarah. If you want to unmute, Marilyn. Or Sarah, if you want to unmute and ask a question too. Oh.
I didn't quite hear, kind of cut off.
Sarah, do you have a question? I see your hand is up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I asked earlier. Sorry.
No
about
worries. Thank you. I'll put your hand down. Anyone,
that.
just
I
feel
get
free
it.
to raise your hand if anyone has a question too throughout.
Oh my gosh. Let's see. I don't know what I'm doing with those hands.
So should I go ahead and continue then, Jayla, or does
Yeah,
Mary?
we're good to continue.
Okay, great. So some other tips on writing when you're telling these stories. And again, so much has changed now in the world of character counts and word counts, but this will help you with your character counts. Just don't be verbose. Don't use big language. Use an active voice, not a passive voice. I've been told to write to the 6th or 8th grade level. Not because the people who are reviewing our grants aren't smart. They're smart, just like we are. It's just they're skimming your documents. They don't have a lot of time to carefully read every beautiful word you write. And I've been advised this. I like this as a rule of thumb. It's the 12-12-12 rule. Imagine that your grant writer that your grant reviewer has to review 12 grants, that yours is the 12th grant they are reviewing, and that it's 12 o'clock midnight. So the concept there is short sentences. Put the most important information at the top of your first paragraph, and then important information at the top of each paragraph after that. Small words. Don't use acronyms. Don't use big intellectual words. Make it something that's skimmable. And remembering that you're trying to show instead of telling. So you want to use examples like the one I just shared with you whenever you can. And you want to be brief, brevity. Verbosity will kill emotion, where if you're brief and you just do short sentences and make the impact and just tell your story, then that will help breed empathy. So let's see. Your first is also other tips for writing. Your first sentence is supposed to get someone's attention. So keep it short and use the right verbs. Not, suffered from a lack of oxygen, suffocated, or the right kind of word that can tell one story. Not struggled with day-to-day living, helpless, right? So just think about how you can really use high impact language. And then also one final tip, and this is not a surprising one, but it's proofread. So actually, Chris, let's go to the next slide. I do want to hit this, prepare to be skimmed, right? We know that when we're reading things, especially now with how we've all gotten to be with the internet and reading things online, we skim. And so it's even more important to be prepared to be skimmed. So use white space, use bullets, use things to kind of break up your text. A friend of mine who received a submission one time, she showed me what the person had submitted. And I kid you not, it was a solid screen of line to line, margin to margin text. because they wanted to get every word in, right? It would have been much more important to go through and edit it and figure out what was the most important information to get in there and to create white space and ways that give to help readers, give road marks to help them skim. Okay, next slide, please.
Oh, and one little thought too, Lisa, is now that so many applications are put into portals, sometimes it can be hard to do some of that formatting, but I always will at least like try to use the dash and create a bullet point list that way, or, you know, anything that you can do even when you're in kind of a tricky situation with those portals and stuff.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. And again, it's anything just to help draw the eye. Because if it's just a big block of black and white text, they're going to miss your most important things. And I've also learned, you know, I'm an expository writer by nature, which means that I like to start out and kind of build to a point. And you can't do that with grants. You put the point you want to make at the top, and then you do your explanation information below. So this slide that says address the curse of knowledge. A lot of times we are so familiar with our programs that we forget to write for someone who might not know our organization. So the sidewalk test is where pretend like if you were walking down a sidewalk and you saw this document lying on the sidewalk and you picked it up and read it, would you be able to understand what was being talked about? So look at every component of what you've written, look for unsupported assumptions, and ask someone outside your organization to read your proposal. And this could be the first time that you're creating your narrative. That's going to be your boilerplate narrative that you'll use. So you don't have to do this every time, but if you've done it up front and you've made sure that you've written good copy from the beginning, then you can use that for boilerplate language later. Next slide, please. Oh, Chris, I think this is you.
Yes. So I'll probably say this a few times, but when you're so we're moving into talking about rubrics, and I know that this is something that we face often when we're doing county or public applications, but the first thing I always say and the last thing and everything in between is just follow directions. It makes all the difference. But of course, doing your grant research, is the first thing. Make sure that you're on target to start with. Always start by reading the directions. And sometimes, I mean, the other day I had a request for proposals for a federal grant that was 136 pages long. And so I had to read that several times, but I had an organization that wanted to apply for a grant that was the guidelines were almost that long. And there was like one bullet point that I found as I was reading through it on the second go through where I realized like they're not eligible. And so to have gone to all that work to do the application would have been really sad if you're not, reading the directions, making sure you're the right fit and that you're getting all of it done. Another client of mine was interested in an application. It's a perfect fit. However, they didn't realize that there was this specific requirement for an environmental review that needed to be done. And that changed the whole process of which deadline we were going to apply for, because that needed to get done first. And so even if I know I don't have time to actually get to writing an application because, it's not due for a couple weeks, sometimes I'll at least try to read through all of the guidelines for any grant that I have that's coming up, just so that if there's a weird flag like that I need to notify somebody in a different department about, or you need to get this taken care of before I can apply, that's always a really good idea. But don't try to form your program to fit a particular funding opportunity. A lot of times, you might be really excited about a particular application that you want to apply for, or like Jayla said, you see, an RFP through the county and it looks like this great fit and it's not exactly what you do, but you really want to do the money. So sometimes you might be tempted to like, well, let's just incorporate this into our programming or whatnot. I'm always really cautious and tell my clients, really just do what you do and do what you do best, and make sure that you're just finding opportunities to fit into that rather than the other way around. However, we're going to be talking, as we talk about getting higher scores, how to communicate what you do and making it a right fit, how to make your square fit into the right square peg so that you are earning as many points as possible. That's a different distinction versus, you know, recreating what you do just to try to get the funding dollars. And then, as always, follow directions. So as we talk about rubric, hopefully everyone here is familiar with what a rubric is or what that process looks like. I'm going to kind of show an example coming up. But again, if you want to get a top score on a rubric, you have to follow directions. Make sure that you're using the templates that they give you. Sometimes this can be a little frustrating, but like you might go to your attachments folder where you decided to get organized, put all of your different attachments, and you might have your perfect budget document that you always attach. And a lot of times, like with these county applications or other public ones, like they want the budget to look a certain way. They want you to put your budget information into a specific spreadsheet. And so it could be, you know, sometimes you're going to get docked points if you think, oh, I'm just going to attach it in the format that I have it. Always use the templates and the forms exactly the way that they give them to you, because when you've got a committee that's doing these scoring processes and they're looking through multiple applications, if they get one that looks different, that's in a different format, it just makes it a lot more difficult for them to assign points. Also, as you're looking through or preparing your application when it has a rubric or a scoring system. And I'm talking about this for applications where they tell you, like, we are scoring based on this rubric. You want to keep in mind who it is that's scoring your application. A lot of times, and Jayla can speak to this, but especially with like county applications, a lot of times it's people who don't, you know, they're just random people that just like live in the county. They are lay people that are just volunteers. And so kind of going along with what Lisa mentioned, and kind of doing like a lower grade level of your writing, not because they're not intelligent, but just to make things as easy for them as possible. And one thing I would mention is don't do a lot of acronyms. Like if you have a lot of that language that's specific to your organization or to your field, assume that whoever's scoring it doesn't know, kind of like Lisa's sidewalk test. Spell things out. Don't use acronyms that other people aren't going to know or understand what it is. Just make it as easy as possible. And I just reiterated it here because it's so helpful when you're specifically talking about getting as many points in a scoring system as possible. But just like Lisa said, make your responses readable. Use lists, use bullets, use headers. And when I'm saying that, I'm saying it in response to getting as many points as possible. So make it clear and easy for them to identify points for you. One tip for this is always begin your answer to a question by rephrasing the question back. Because, you know, when a scorer is going through, they have a set list of this person gets points if they do X, Y, Z. So if you were to make it easy to say, you know, for example, do they describe their process for collecting data clearly? And if that's the question, you know, the way that we gather our data is da, 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 da. That just makes it so that their eye is looking for that specific phrase. And if you make it easy for them to find it, it's a lot easier to get more points. So here's an example. And one of the, like, this is an example of what a scoring rubric would look like for a county or somebody might give to the committee. They'll say, okay, here's question number 2, and this is how many points the applicant can get based on what their response is. And one thing that is a good idea for how to get more points is to look. A lot of times they'll publish this scoring rubric. I know that the county does this often. They'll just straight up tell you this is how you get the most points. So take advantage of that and use it as clues. This was the question: describe your experience with the adolescent population and/or sexual education. There are a lot of ways that if you saw just that question, you might answer, and they might be really great answers, but I always will go through and look at, okay, number 4 points. What do I need to do? The applicant has extensive experience with both of these issues. As you can see in the question, they give you the option to discuss both of them or just one of them. But clearly, if you describe both, you get more points. And so if you look at the rubric and what they provide you, you can find some of those clues and realize, oh, I would have been answering the question perfectly fine, only talking about one of them. But now I see that I can get an extra point by talking about both of them. This is another example of like they might just ask you to describe the need for your program. That's a really generic question. You have a lot of different ways that you can answer it, but I like looking at the maximum points of 2. The applicant demonstrated a strong need in their area and or with their selected priority population through the use of data. That gives you a lot of clues of what they're asking for. Let's not just talk about one or the other, but let's talk about the need specifically in my area, specifically for my priority population, and then use data. Like that's 3 specific clues that I didn't necessarily get just by looking at the question. Okay, so obviously reading the scoring rubric for clues, like we just mentioned, be specific and detailed. This is something that we've heard directly from the county, that a lot of times applicants might kind of speak in generic terms, or they'll be really broad. But going back to trying to get more points, the more specific you are, the more detailed you are, the more points that you can gain. Also, I think like maybe go back and look through your narrative and say, is there a place, instead of saying this generic statement, can I put in a specific detail about something that we do, a specific statistic? Anything more specific is always helpful. Also, exceed expectations just in case. I had an example where this was I think this was a county application, and in the guidelines, it said that if you were asking for money for a project that was like a construction project that cost more than $1,000, that you needed to get bids. But if it was less than $1,000, you didn't need to. And so ours was like right on that cusp. And it was like, oh, well, we don't have to get a bid. Like, let's not worry about it. Well, we ended up not getting funded because somebody on the committee wanted a bid. Now, it wasn't really super fair because we had followed the rules. But like I said, sometimes the committee members are just people in the community. And it was probably more confusion on their part. But when you have a situation like that, like, you know, they're trying to fund all sorts of different programs and they're looking for different ways to figure out how to cut the ones out that they don't have funding for. And so if you're kind of on a borderline like that, like just exceed the expectations, just throw in the extra bid, even if you don't have to, just to make sure that you're not getting into a situation like that. And then just like Lisa mentioned, have someone else who doesn't know your program review it. Because as I've mentioned, it's probably somebody who doesn't know your program that is reviewing it and actually making the decisions. And so getting their feedback is really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, always start early. I know that can be really hard, but start as early as possible, at least with the review, so that you know like the list of things that needs to happen. And especially if you need to ask people who aren't you, like you might be fine staying up till midnight, but maybe one of your coworkers isn't. Make sure you at least farm out the information that you need from others early, and then you can, you know, work on it on your own time. And I've mentioned this earlier in this workshop, but don't be afraid to ask questions. There are some things that JLA or the county, they're not allowed to coach applications. But you know, they'll often have like a review period where individuals are allowed to like submit questions, and then they can publish them so that everybody has the access in a fair and universal way. They'll do like an FAQ board or things like that. The worst thing they'll say is we're not allowed to answer that question, but the best thing is you get answers, and don't be shy to ask for the help that you need.
Chris, can I say one more thing about back on your bullet point about starting early? This also goes back to my favorite axe to grind, which is about your language. And I find that even if I write something and put it aside for a few days, if I give myself the luxury of even that much time, it helps me so much to go in and see where maybe I've used a word incorrectly, or maybe the flow isn't good, or maybe I've made some assumptions about readers' knowledge that they might not have. So even just having a few days to be away from it helps so much in making it a stronger narrative. And also really looking at, are we asking the questions that they're telling us to address? I mean, are we answering the questions that they're telling us to address?
Perfect. Yep. Excellent. Jayla, or we've kind of mentioned this here and there, but one thing that is really common in applications that don't get funded through the county or other public organizations is that applicants will kind of, maybe for example, the application is specifically asking for programs that are going to provide sexual education. And you'll have an organization that does a lot of things for youth, and they'll talk all about everything that they do for youth, their homework programs, they feed the kids snacks after school, they do this, they do that, and they don't like drill down and focus on just the activity or program that that particular application is going to be funding. So really be mindful of that, that a lot of times these applications are not just general operating funding, but they're actually asking for something very specific. And you might do a lot of other really great things. And sometimes it's appropriate to do a quick overview like that. In like, usually there'll be a question like, give us just an overview of your mission or whatnot. Great. But then once it gets into all of the other questions on your programs and all of that, like they're wanting to know, what specifically are you doing that applies to this funding request? And I think that goes along with the question that we had earlier, like how do you like fit everything in when you have just like a 500 word limit or whatnot? Well, it will help a lot if you don't talk about stuff that they're not wanting to fund like that. They might love everything about what you're doing, and if it applies, or if there's a question about like how those things might support what you're doing, that's great. But I wrote this down, that you need to drill down on your program descriptions to see where you qualify for restricted funding, or to show how you meet a funder's priorities. Articulate how what you are doing already fits their giving interests or the RFP. It's just really important to look at what they're asking for and making sure that you're providing them with exactly how you fit into that peg just right.
Yeah, real quick, Chris, I just shared an example of an open RFA we have out right now. It's for construction and building trades, so I'm sure it doesn't fit what anyone is doing here, but you can see an example of an RFA and an application and a budget and staffing template. And as Chris mentioned, please read the RFA. We have a lot of folks who just go straight to the application and don't ever read the RFA. So you can see that all there for an example.
Perfect.
And I'd like to say too, because I know we have some really small organizations on the call today. Sometimes an organization is small or inexperienced at fundraising or grant writing, and they don't know how to talk about what they do beyond describing it as general operations. Like, for example, we are a church. And so they only know how to go in and ask sort of for very general fundraising. Well, what if you say, we are a church and here are the things that we do? We have a food pantry, we have youth programming, we have aging services, we have so a lot of different sub things that you do within your operations that you can think of in terms of those being a program. So then you can actually qualify to ask for money for the program rather than just sort of throwing your whole organization in as a general operating request.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. All right, I wonder, did anybody, we're going to move kind of to a totally different topic, so I don't know if anybody has any questions about scoring rubrics, or at least if we want to do that all just at the end. But since I can't see the chat, like Jayla, are we good, or were there any questions on any of that before we switch?
We're good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we had a lot of questions in people registering for the workshop about building budgets. And so we're going to just kind of briefly go over that. Most organizations do a really great job of putting together their organization budget, but then they go to write an application and it asks for a program budget. This can be especially challenging if you're requesting funding for a program that is specific enough that you maybe haven't ever put together a budget just for that program. So just to kind of do a quick, we'll kind of skip over these first ones since we're getting down to our last half hour. But you have, obviously within revenue, you'll have like different line items, right? Earned income, which some organizations do not have, some do. You'll have your government, public support, private support. In kind, we had some people in the last workshop who didn't know what in kind meant. In kind is anything that's not actual money or cash. So, for example, donations of supplies or equipment, or sometimes even time. Some organizations will count like, I had one who, like, the executive director who started the nonprofit didn't draw a salary. And then they ended up hiring, she kind of got it set up and then she moved on and they hired an executive director who they did pay. But she counted the time that she spent as the executive director as like an in-kind donation of like what her time was worth. So you can put all of that together as your revenue. And then of course we know the different types of expenses, right? So when you're putting together a program budget, it's really important to talk about, and I'll skip over this. I think we're familiar with all the things that it costs to do a program. But the important thing is to think of things in terms of direct versus indirect costs. What you want to do is go through your expenses and kind of think of it in terms of 3 different labels. Is this program related? Is this admin or administrative, or is it potentially a mix of both? I'll give you an example. What you want to do is you want to, okay, what do I absolutely need in order to make this program run? And anything that's like a direct tie to the program would be a program expense. So if you are a food bank, obviously if you go and you purchase food, the cost of food is a program expense. Also, the drivers who drive the food, that would be a program expense. The box trucks that keep the food refrigerated, that would be a program expense. The boxes that you buy to sort the food into, program expense. Admin expense would be some of those higher level things that your organization needs in order to run, but that aren't specific to the program. So for example, the warehouse that holds the food would be a program expense, but admin might be, the office where your HR manager works. You need an HR manager to have everything happen, but they would be more of an admin expense. Other expenses that are typically admin, and actually maybe what I'll do is to kind of go through that, I'll show you kind of an example. And these numbers are just kind of thrown in there. But as you can see on the left-hand column are admin costs, and on the right side are program costs. So when I'm putting together a program budget, I'll take, everything that I'm working with and I will assign it. Does it go over here into programs? Or does it go over here into admin? Or is it in the third category and it's maybe both? If it's potentially both, then you think about what percentage of it would apply to program versus admin. And this will totally depend on your program. And this really is a great conversation to have, either if it's you or the executive director or the program director or whatnot, as long as you can justify it. Like, there's no right or wrong answer, as long as you can really like justify the percentages that you're coming up with. In this particular example, it's a fairly new organization. There's only 4 staff members. And so the executive director is an unusually high percentage of what I would call program costs. She's she's in a lot of the day-to-day of everything. And there's really only one program that they operate. And so I asked her and she says, I probably spend 75% of my time like actually making sure this program is running. And then she spends about 25% of her time doing more administrative duties. And so I have 75% of her time in the program budget. Do not think that you can't put salary into program budget. It absolutely can go as long as it's justifiable. Her program manager and her intake coordinators are 100% program. Like, everything they do is like directly serving the clients and the people that they're helping. And so their whole salary can go in as a program expense. If you have an education program, anybody who's a teacher would probably be 100% program versus maybe the grant writer or a different position that's not spending as much of their time doing that. And as you can see, there's some things that I put completely just in administrative and I didn't break out the percentage, like insurance policies or state fees, maybe the bank or merchant fees, the grant writer, sometimes, a lot of times anything that's fundraising related, typically is considered more of an admin expense. So I know that we had a lot of questions on this when we were in person. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask any specific questions about admin versus program, or if we're just good to go. But that's all I have on budget information. Is there anybody in the chat, Jayla, or are we good to move forward to logic models?
I don't see anyone.
Okay. We're happy to help answer any of those questions at the end if you're trying to think of something specific to your organization. But Lisa, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, great. So those of you who have worked on public funding grants often may have been asked to do a logic model. And I know when I first heard that term, it was so illogical to me that I didn't know what it meant, but now that I've been working with it for a number of years. I think logic models can be really great tools for us to use as grant writers. So just very essentially, the definition of a logic model is it's a diagram that links the problem to the activities that your organization proposes engaging with, and then it talks about what your planned outcomes are. So basically is like it shows a flow from here's the problem, we've identified the need in our community. So the need is the problem. Here's how we think it needs to be fixed, and here are the activities and the things the activities we're going to do to fix it. Here are the things we need for our activities. And then here's what we project will be the outcomes and the outputs of our activities. So let's drill down on some of those definitions in the next slide. So the basic logic model components, and usually you'll see a logic model more as sort of a vertical, sort of a pillar typed shape, a diagram. You can Google logic model, you'll see tons of different examples of them. But the basic components are inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. So the next slide defines inputs. Inputs are the resources that are required to implement the program. So if you're going to hold a rummage sale, what are the inputs that you need to hold the rummage sale? Well, you need a parking lot, or you need a church basement, or you need a school gymnasium. You need a place to hold it. You need some staff or volunteers to manage it. You need someone to communicate, to request donations, to get the rummage. You need a place to store the rummage, again, while it's coming in. You might need office supplies. You might need ways to get the word out that the sale's occurring. So this list underneath: funding, space, staff, computers, office supplies, marketing materials. Those are sort of the business inputs. But if you're running a small volunteer organization, you're going to need to identify those same things. Say, okay, we're going to need some money to do this. We're going to need some all hands on deck to do this. We're going to need someone to help build a website. We're going to need someone to help do social media. So anything that you think you're going to need to carry out the program is an input. Let's go to the next slide. So what are the activities? This is your next column. What the program does to accomplish its goals. So this is really straight up, like you hold a class, or you hand out a pamphlet, or you provide food, or you teach kids, or you, in the case of our rummage sale example, the activity would be you accumulate the goods and then you put the goods out. And so what are all and it's really helpful to break it down and think of not just, for example, holding the rummage sale as the activity, but all the different pieces of what holding the rummage sale will entail. Because the more information that you have in your logic model as you're building it, the more useful it will be to you later, and also the better it looks in a grant if you've got more information in your logic model. So the next slide talks about our next column, which is outputs. And this is an important distinction to make between this column, outputs, and the next column, which is outcomes. So outputs are the direct products of your work or your program measured in units. So, okay, I know that's not really clear, but basically, if anything with a number in it is an output. So we held this number of classes, we handed out this many pamphlets, we distributed this much food, we gave out this many student badges, anything that, and a lot of times, or it might be this many people came to our program, this many people came to our educational workshop. A lot of times organizations will make the mistake of listing an output as an outcome. Outputs are just ways to measure that you're reaching or achieving what you need to do in order to get to the next slide, which is your outcome. So outcomes are the benefits to those who engage in the program after they've participated in your activities. So in our example of the rummage sale, we sold as an output, we had this many people come to our rummage sale. We earned this much money as a result of our rummage sale. The outcome would be we now have this much money to put back into our church programs. And that's actually still an output when you say this much money. Remember, anything with a number in it, but an outcome would be what were the things that happened within your church programs as a result of having the rummage sale. And so that could be that you now can do more youth education, or you can now serve more people food. So the outcomes are often in the kinds of organizations that we work with. An outcome might be if we have an after-school organization as a client. An output might be this many kids came to our day at the museum to learn about XYZ program. The outcome of that would be the children understood the importance of environmental conservation, or they understood what happened to the dinosaurs all those years ago. And we measured it this way. We might done a survey before they came, and then we did a survey after they attended the event, and we know their information, their knowledge changed this much. And a lot of times, if with a really involved logic model, you'll see that they break it into initial outcomes, midterm outcomes, and long-term outcomes. So usually an initial outcome is, for example, the measurement of a survey afterward that based on the survey they completed after participating in the program, the children demonstrated this much knowledge about dinosaurs or about environmental conservation. Well, an intermediate outcome might be that the children 6 months later or 1 year later were engaging in community programs to help with environmental conservation. And a long-term outcome could be that upon graduating from high school, this many of the young adults were participating in conservation programs. So you'll see that for the logic model, tracking the longer term outcomes is really usually just in the bailiwick of larger organizations that have a lot of capacity to track and monitor. For most of us, we'll just need to be able to report some initial outcomes, and we just need to be able to make the distinction between the outputs, so anything with a number, and the outcomes, which is more behavioral, or how their activity has changed, or their thoughts have changed. Let's go to the next slide, Chris. An output versus an outcome. It's not how many worms the bird feeds its young, but how well the fledgling flies. So the worms that the bird feeds its young is an output. How well the fledgling flies is an outcome. And next slide, please. Here's some other examples. So if your output is to implement new curriculum, so maybe that's implement curricula in 5 classes, the outcome would be to increase knowledge. if you're going to, as an output, provide the training, maybe provide like today's training, our desired outcome would be to improve skills. Or if our output is to share resources with 60 people, our outcome would be to build capacity of those people within their organizations. Pick up litter is to beautify communities. You can see the distinctions there. And so the sort of the tacit or the unstated part here of outcomes, and how do we know that we increase knowledge? How do we know that we improve skills? How do we know that we built capacity or that we beautified communities? So you also, sometimes a logic model will ask you to articulate what kinds of measures you're going to do to know that you achieved your outcome, your desired outcome that you are striving for. This is a lot of information. Logic models are kind of confusing, and I really boiled it down to the basic parts. Jayla, do we have any questions coming in?
See any?
Okay.
Okay.
So now Chris is going to jump into SMART goals.
And this is the last main section of our workshop. I see we have about 15 minutes left. I would definitely want to make sure if we don't have any generic questions left, but we'll go through these. And as I mentioned before, we have a folder of different documents from this worksheet or from this workshop. And one of them includes a worksheet that outlines everything I'm just going to go through coming up. So we'll go ahead and a lot of times you'll be specifically asked to make sure that your goals are SMART. And SMART just is an acronym for making sure that they're specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Even if you're writing a grant that doesn't specifically ask you to outline SMART goals, these are great tips for any grant where you, or even just your own program management, to think about how you can do a better job of actually measuring the impact that you're making. And so to start, I have like just a basic generic goal. Students participating in the program will develop positive relationships. It's a great goal, but we're going to go through how we can make it SMART. To make it more specific, you want to make sure that it's direct, it's meaningful, and as we've talked a lot today, make sure it's detailed. So in order to do that, in the yellow, I've shown how we can apply that to this specific goal. Students participating in the AQI program will show improvement in their skills related to positive interpersonal relationships. That makes it a lot more specific, because it can be really difficult to say that something, abstract is improving. But if you can show improvement, and we'll talk about how we can measure that, which would be the next goal, you need to make sure it's quantifiable or specific enough to track progress or success. A lot of times, like as Lisa was talking about outcomes, this is sort of a way that you can think, okay, what are the outputs? What are the ways that I can measure this outcome? And here's an example for this particular goal. To make it measurable, they said, let's say 80% of students participating in the AQI program for at least 30 days or more will show improvement in their skills related to positive interpersonal relationships. We'll show in a future slide how they're going to do that measurement, but you can show that you're actually having an impact if you have at least 80% of students participating in the program. You're not going to have that impact if you're not measuring the number of students, or if it's only 20%, for example. And so showing that you've got a percentage, it's getting more detailed, it's getting more specific, which also shows that you're measuring something about the goal. You also want to make sure that it's attainable. Like we sometimes, world peace is super great, but breaking it down to something that is actually something that you can have an impact directly with makes it attainable. Make sure it's realistic and that you actually have the tools and resources to achieve it. And in this example, they add in that they're going to report this improvement and measure it through their pre and post surveys. So that's how they make this goal attainable. They've got this as their avenue and their structure in place to actually measure the information that is being requested. Making sure that it's relevant means that it aligns with your overall project goal and your problem of practice. In this one, it doesn't necessarily change how we write the goal, but what you're wanting to do is just make sure this outcome statement, is it relevant? Does this align with an actual problem that even needs to be addressed? And will we and our programs actually help solve it? In this situation, there is a need because students are lacking skills and resources for healthy interpersonal skills. That makes this goal relevant. Sometimes you just might want to evaluate, is this goal something that's even like a problem that we should be focusing on, or should we be structuring things in a way that we're really addressing the greatest needs of those we're serving? And then the last one, I think, is the easiest one, but you've got to just put in a target date or a deadline so that it's not a goal that's just floating out there inevitably. So in this example, it'd be the purple, that by this date, May 1st, we will see if 80% of our students participating in the program for at least 30 days will report an improvement in their skills related to positive interpersonal relationships as measured through our student pre and post surveys. As you can see, this goal went from being really vague, really generic, and not super specific. We're not showing how we're accomplishing it. And then it gets to this result that makes it a lot more impactful. It also helps you think of how to actually structure your programs so that you're gathering this data. So it's a useful tool, not just to communicate to the funder what you're doing, but I think it also helps the program actually do a better job of actually having the impact that it wants to. So like I said, this is kind of all put into a one-page worksheet on the drive that Jayla will be sending out.
And I want to say that, Chris, you know what you were just saying about it helps you to achieve what you're striving to achieve. That's the thing with logic models too, is they force a discipline, and thinking in terms of SMART goals forces a discipline so that even before you start your program, you're thinking about all the steps you need to go through, all the money you need to come up with, all the people you need to engage, so that you're much more likely to achieve what you're setting out to achieve than if you don't engage in these processes. So they take time up front, but they definitely help you to, first of all, secure funding, but then also to achieve what you set out to achieve, and then to be able to report on it. And I've always said that the one of the most important ways to ensure that you get funding a second time is to do a really good job of reporting on it the first time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lisa, do you want to just finish up with?
Sure. Yeah. So we've given lots of specifics. We started out with some general information, and then we gave lots of specific, and now we're kind of broadening up again. This is a roundup of some of the characteristics of proposals that get funded. So clear and simple writing. Remember, no acronyms, no long sentences, no words that don't make sense to everybody. A compelling statement of need. And remember, I always like to say that organizations don't have needs, communities have needs. So you say there's a need in our community for accessible housing for low income families. And then you make, so it's a compelling statement of need because you have data to support the need. You have information that backs up your assumption that there is a need. And it's a compelling need that is critical at this moment in our culture and our society. Then you lay out a practical and common sense plan to address the need and your objective measures. So that, right, those two bullets right there are your logic model and your SMART goals. Practical common sense plan, that's your logic model, and your objective measures of success are your logic model and your measurable goals. You've built a tight and no nonsense budget. And I like budgets. I like my budgets to not just be big in general, but to be really specific. Like this person for this much time equals, this percentage of this person's salary for this many dollars. And then here's what that person's going to do during that percentage of their time. This staff person for this amount of time, here's what they're going to do. Or these particular items that we need. So a really specific budget, not bloated, And I also do like to include, when I'm doing a private foundation grant, this is not for federal funding or public funding, but I also like to include a line for administration, because without the administration, meaning someone paying the light bills, someone paying the HR person, someone paying the accountant, there's no place for all the programming to occur. Broad financial support, the second to the last bullet, what that means is you show that you have other funders coming to the table. And even if it's other funders who, maybe it's your board who's donating their time, right? So that's an in-kind donation. So maybe you don't have any actually funders coming to the table with money. You need to show some other support. So you have volunteer support that you monetize and you put that in your budget. Or you have some in-kind donations of, for example, food or shoes or clothing. Put those things, in-kind donations, in your budget. Show support from as many different types of funders as you can. So that means volunteer support, donations of goods, donations of services, and donations of money. And then the benefits. And that again goes back to your logic model. Just show that you can actually achieve the outcomes you set out to achieve. And here's how we're going to verify and measure that we did that. So here are the opposite, the characteristics of losing proposals. Vague objectives, like Chris's SMART goal, where she just sort of, where it started out as that one really sort of vague sentence, and then she drilled down on it. Make sure to drill down on your objectives. You don't measure your results. You lose bad writing. You don't edit. You don't proofread. Think about if it's down to two potential organizations who are going to get this money, and your grant is well written, and the other party's grant is not well written. Who do you think is going to get the money? I mean, if they're on all the other merits, they're both strong, but it comes down to the writing. I always think that a well-written grant shows just a more organized and prepared organization. Unrealistic budgets, that just shows the funder that you haven't thought through your logic model or your goals and really thought about what you need to achieve and what it's going to cost to achieve them. You have unworkable plans, or that your solutions don't match the problem, or that you can't show that you have any other supporters coming to support your work. And then this last slide is from a funder's perspective. There's an article on what foundation funders, so private foundation funders, look for and why they will often deny a request. First of all, the organization didn't do their research, so the request for money doesn't meet the funder's priorities, or it's outside the funder's geographic area. Remember, Chris and I both said that this is one of the first places we start when we're doing funding prospect research. We look at who funds in our community. Number 3, they didn't follow the instructions. We cannot say that enough, how important it is to follow the instructions. Poorly written. The budget is outside, so you're asking for too much money, or maybe your budget's $100,000 and this group doesn't, only has $5,000. Or that they don't know who you are. And again, we've talked about the importance of developing relationships, or at least making connections. At the very least, if you can't make a connection, then show other funders that are funding you that this funder might know. And that's kind of an abrupt end to a lot of talking, but I think that gives us about 5 minutes for questions. So I don't know how you want to do that, Jayla.
I think, well, let's just open it up. If anyone has questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, but I don't see any hands.
Do you have any suggestions for increasing an ask after a funder has been giving you a certain amount for a long time?
That's a really good question. And I know some foundations just kind of get stuck in a rut. A lot of times they will a private foundation will base their giving amount on your budget size. So if your budget for your organization or for your program has not grown appreciably, then they probably won't give more. My first, if I really wanted to increase an ask amount, would be to talk to the funder. And just like Chris said, don't be afraid to contact them and ask what they would, why they're giving at this level, what might, encourage them to consider giving more. Chris, do you have other feedback on that?
No, I have, when I've thought that maybe we could increase it in the past, I think it's always good to like give a reason. Like, we are so grateful for past support. However, we have this new specific program that we would love like your help with, or, you know, we've had, for example, I have a client who they get a lot of funding from the state to help with some school programs, but they currently have like 350 schools waiting on their wait list for the services that they provide. And so if you can justify the increased ask by, you know, saying the increased need that has happened or something like that, but to just do a higher amount and just have your same typical narrative, I don't think is as compelling as pointing to either increased need or something like that.
I think now, especially with costs going up across the board everywhere, I think a lot of people are going in, a lot of organizations are going to be going in for more money. So it's going to be really important that you be able to make the case for why really, and like, again, sorry to keep harping on this, but going back to thinking through your inputs and your activities and your logic model, like why what they've funded is going to be costing more or is going to be accomplishing more, so that they should give more. You really need to be really specific and thoughtful about why you need more money.
Thank you very much.
I have my hand up, so I'm just going to jump in. Is that okay?
Yeah.
This is Diane. Yes. I think it was Lisa. You mentioned that there's an article when we were on the slide of the funder's perspective, and I was very interested in learning a little bit more and kind of diving deeper in that. And I can certainly do my own research. But is that article available to us in the folder?
You know, as I was saying those words, I was thinking, oh shoot, where did I find that? I think honestly, Diane, that I was just a couple years ago Googling and I found it. And
Okay.
it was from a source that I believed. It was like Foundation Directory or somewhere online. And I'm sorry I don't have more information than that, but you can try Googling it.
That's okay. I'm well versed at Googling.
By the way, you know, I was given a tip at a conference I attended last year that said that for those of you who use Firefox, that Firefox sometimes gives more accurate results than Google, which I found interesting. So I've actually put the Firefox search engine on my computer, and I'll Google and I'll do Firefox and just see what I get.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. Well,
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. Just to let everyone know on this call, we have another in-person workshop on May 2nd at the county building from 1 to 3 p.m. So that's another in-person option. Please spread the word, and I will send this recording out when it is finished in a couple of days along with the resources. Thank you, Pathways, Lisa and Chris, for doing this again. That was great.
It was delightful to have you all here.
yes, and good luck on some hopefully improved grant funding. So
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jayla. And yeah, and if any of you want to come see our show in person, we will be at the county on May 2nd. The Chris and Lisa show.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. I'll end the recording and close the meeting room. Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.